Hello everyone and welcome to the Enology webinar series. My name is Aude Watrelot. I am an associate professor and Enology extension specialist with Texas A&M Texas AgriLife Extension Services. Today's webinar topic is Piquette, and I would like to start by introducing our presenter, Dr. Aude Watrelot. Dr. Watrelot is an assistant professor and extension specialist of Enology in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. Dr. Watrelot's research area is fruit, grape, and wine, tannin and polysaccharide chemistry, and their relationship with wine quality. Aude graduated with a PhD degree in food science from the French National Institute for Agricultural Research and the University of Avignon in France. Following graduation, Dr. Watrelot moved to California, both at CSU Fresno and UC Davis, to keep conducting research into polyphenol-macromolecular interactions on red wine chemistry. At ISU, she is currently conducting research and developing extension programs on understanding viticultural and winemaking practices that could maximize phenolics extraction and improve wine quality. And with that, Aude, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrea, for the nice introduction and the few explanation about the topic that we're going to touch about today. So as Andrea mentioned, we're going to talk about Piquette. And so I don't know if you've heard already about Piquette in the past, but that's a product that is using Grape Pomace, which is the key ingredient in making Piquette. And that's a great way to reuse or to add value to a common waste. So talking about waste that's obtained during the winemaking process. So you already probably know that, but there is a lot of different waste that are provided throughout the process. The first waste would be grapes. Depending on the quality of the grapes, you may have grapes that are a waste. And then depending on the winemaking process you're going to do, so if you start to make white wines, or red wines, you're going to have different waste throughout that process. Some common waste are including the stems of the clusters. That's also including water. Water is a lot of, it's a big portion of the waste of the winemaking process. Also carbon dioxide, that's a waste. And so the waste that we're going to talk about today is really pomace. And so I'm going to talk a lot about pomace. There are two types of pomace. So depending on the winemaking process that you're doing, you can have white pomace, which is also called the fresh pomace or virgin pomace. That's the residue that's obtained right after pressing of the grapes, of the white grapes. And that's called virgin pomace because it's containing everything from the grapes. So it didn't go through any fermentation, and that's really rich in sugars. The other pomace would be the fermented pomace that correspond to the pomace that's obtained during the red winemaking process. And so that's rich in different constituents. So it's rich in, you can have yeast, obviously, because it's obtained after pressing, after alcoholic fermentation. The fermented pomace, that's what we obtain after alcoholic fermentation or after pressing, but it might contain some yeast, obviously, because it's obtained after alcoholic fermentation, but also some bacteria if you do malolactic fermentation during your red winemaking process. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those microorganisms that can be responsible for some microbial spoilage you can have. So that's one aspect, one risk that you can have when you reuse the pomace. So just a few numbers, just to give you an idea of how much pomace is produced every year in the world. So it's about 12 millions of tons of pomace that's used or that's produced every year. From 20% of all the grapes that are processed, so those 20% represent the pomace. And so just to give you an idea of the quantity of pomace that's produced from 6 liters of wine, you can get 1 kilogram of pomace. So that's a lot of product or byproduct that's commonly not really used. And so in pomace, as I explained a little bit, you have skins, seeds, stems, a little bit of flesh, depending on when it has been processed and how it has been processed. But also the main component of the pomace, as you can expect, is moisture or is water. And so the more moisture content you have, the more risk of microbial spoilage you have. That's also rich in fibers, so cellulose, lignin, pectic substances, proteins, but also phenolic compounds. And so that's why a lot of different products are being produced from that pomace, because it's rich in polyphenols or phenolic compounds. And those compounds are beneficial for health. Like they have antioxidant properties, they are antimicrobial. So there are a lot of different use that can be done from that pomace. So commonly, pomace is either used as animal feeding, and so you can see, I know some winemakers who provide the pomace to pigs, or in Iowa, we are the first producer of pigs in the US. So that's a good way to use pomace just for animal feeding, but also to cows or to goats. And there is a project that's currently ongoing at UC Davis where they try to evaluate how the use of pomace for animal feeding can impact the methane emissions. Other use of pomace would be compost, and that's most of the use of pomace is through composting. But that's a pro to use as compost, but there are cons that are really related to the environment. And so if you use pomace as compost, that can increase the nitrogen leaching and oxygen depletion. So that's not the best option. Then you can use pomace for grappa by distilling pomace. So it's involving another process step, but that's commonly used in the industry. Also, there are new products that are being developed in fortified products, so bread or cookies with pomace, also chocolate with pomace. You can also use, so pomace, as I explained, is a combination of skins and seeds and stems. And so in the seeds, you have a lot of oil. That's a lipidic. It's composed of lipids, and so you can extract the oil from the seeds. The oil is used for cosmetics. So you can find, for example, lipsticks that are made with oil from seeds. And it has good property as well because it's rich in phenolic compounds. So that's another use of pomace. And commonly, it's just placed in the landfill. And so that's where it's challenging to have pomace and to not reuse that common waste. Because if it's in the landfill, that's going to lead to potential environmental pollution. So that's where you can get a lot of pests and disease being developed in that pomace that can attract insects. And that's also going to lead to some pollution to the water and change or modify the acidity of the soil. So there is always people looking for other options to use or to add value to the pomace. And so another option to use pomace is to make piquette. And so piquette, what is it? So piquette, so I'm from France. And so when I grew up, I always used to hear people saying, oh, this wine is a piquette. And that was really a bad term. It was to explain that the wine wasn't good. It was most of the time a mediocre wine, pretty acidic. It was, bad quality wine. But actually, piquette comes from the French term piquet, which means prickle. And so it has a lot of different other names because piquette, you're going to see, is a really old product. So it's new in the sense that it's becoming more and more popular now, but it used to be made by Romans. So it's really an old product. And so the other term that are used to describe Piquette are Acquarello, Acquapazza, Laura, Vinello, or just water wine. And so it's not actually a wine, that's really a beverage that's made from the addition of water to the grape pomace. And so it's not technically characterized by the term wine. It's not a wine. So that's a modern drink now with the low alcohol by volume. So the percentage of alcohol is between 4 to 9. So most of the time that's below 10% of alcohol that you have. And so it's a fizzy drink, fancy drink with a lot of aromatic profile, a lot of aromas that's not meant to be aged. So that's a product that's made in a short amount of time, and that's meant to be drank pretty young. And so just a little bit about the history of Piquette. So as I said, it's a very old product because it used to be made by Romans during the winemaking process or the winemaking season. When Romans were making the wines, they had all that pomace that remained, and they just added some water and waited to have fermentation ongoing. So it was a spontaneous fermentation ongoing on that pomace soaked in water. And so it led to a product that was pretty acidic, that was with a little bit of VA, I believe, and that's why it was not really appreciated. It was appreciated, but now it has that term of Piquette. I think that's why we relate that to a mediocre wine. That's because of that VA characteristic that you can have. But that's also a beverage that's leading to some bubbles. So it means sapique. So it's like, so Piquette is from piquet, sapique. It's, the bubbles is just sprinkling everywhere in your mouth. So that's a drink that used to be made, so as I said, by the Romans, but also in the modern times, it was prepared by workers in wineries just as a low cost and low alcohol drink. And workers were just drinking that while they were making the wine. So that was an easy drink, low alcohol wine, or low alcohol beverage, I should say. And so unfortunately, so in France, in 1907, Piquette has been forbidden to sell. And that was because it was becoming a product really overproduced. So almost everywhere they were producing Piquette. And so to avoid having too much Piquette being produced and less wine being sold, they forbade to sell the Piquette. So from 1907, it's still forbidden for winemakers in France to sell Piquette. So you can make Piquette, but you're not allowed to sell it. Compared to what's happening in France, if you look at the trends in the US and in Japan, Piquette is becoming more and more popular. And that's really based on the consumer's demand, where consumers is always looking for new things, fashion product, low alcohol product. And so it has becoming, as I said, more and more popular in the US and in Japan. So just to give you some ideas about where Piquette is produced and sold in North America, there are a few wineries who sells a few number of cases of Piquette every year. And so that's just to give you some numbers there. So based on everything that I explained, so I wanted to show you what was the plan, or what was the goal of the research we developed. So we worked on a project to reuse that common waste, so pomace, trying to identify how could we do a new product that consumers are looking for, and that would be so accepted by consumers, but also a good way to reuse that common waste. So how can we reuse pomace to make a new beverage? So that was really the way of thinking behind the project we did. And so that's a project that we did 2 years ago now, because there are a lot of different techniques to make piquette, and there is no one specific technique that's published and available. So I guess it depends on the style of piquette that you want to produce, how much you want to put in place to produce that piquette. So in the past, as I explained in the history, piquette was made just by adding water to the pomace, and then fermentation was spontaneously ongoing based on the yeast that were already present. So white yeast that were present on the grapes. And so that's what I call the no additives techniques. There are other techniques where you can do similarly, but you're going to add sugar in addition to adding water. And that's really just to get a targeted Brix for a targeted alcohol content. And that will go faster. Fermentation will go faster as well. And you will have, you're going to have still some risk of microbial spoilage, and fermentation, because it's going to be spontaneous, can be difficult to control. Another technique that can be used is just by adding water to the pomace and adding sugar as well before inoculating the yeast. And so by adding the yeast or using by inoculating yeast, you have a better control of the fermentation. You're going to have a better management of fermentation and the final product. It doesn't mean that you don't have to check regularly, because you can have a lot of things that can go wrong, if I can say like that. And I'm going to explain that later. And the fourth technique that can be used is by soaking pomace. And so that's really using the pomace. You add water, you let it soak for a few days under potassium metabisulfite control and acidity control, just making sure there is no microbial spoilage before pressing. And then from the juice that you obtain at pressing, that's when you add sugar, and then you add the yeast. And so that's really a technique that we use for the project we developed. So that was really on soaked pomace. And so that's a study that we were able to publish recently. So I'm going to show the data that we published in this paper, but I'm not going to show everything. So feel free to go back on that paper later. So basically, what we wanted to do was to compare between two different things. So we looked at the effect of pomace to water ratio, and we also looked at the effect of yeast strains used, and also the different varieties of grapes used. So for this first aspect of the project, where we looked at the difference between pomace to water ratio, we use Petite Pearl. So Petite Pearl, I don't know if you're familiar with that grape cultivar, but that's a cold hardy grape that's becoming more and more popular in the Midwest, so in Iowa, in Minnesota, that has been developed or bred by a private breeder in Minnesota. So it's a pretty new variety. It's probably like 10 years old. But it's a red grape. And so it has a very good characteristics for red wines. And so because we were making red wines in 2022 from Petite Pearl, we wanted to see how Piquette from that Petite Pearl pomace would be. And so this aspect of the project was done with a winemaker in Iowa. And so we used two beans, so two different pomace to water ratio. Bean 1, which is called PPB1, was using 90 kilograms of pomace for 378 liters of water, compared to PPB2, so the bean number 2, where we had double the amount of pomace for the same amount of water. So we just compared like 1-to-2 ratio. So after we had the pomace into the beans, we did include the water, so same amount of water, and we let it soak for about 2 days at cold temperature. So that was really to maintain, to avoid getting too much spoilage ongoing. Also, we use potassium metabisulfite and citric acid just to get a low pH and to avoid microbial spoilage. After those 2 days, we pressed everything. We used a little bit of juice from other grapes of Petite Pearls, but we did add sugar to have a target of bricks of 12 bricks. And so that's a target that we put just to make sure we had a little bit of alcohol, but not too much. So, and then we did inoculate with the yeast exotics mosaics. We use GoFerm, we use Ferment K and DAP, and that was really to provide enough nutrients for the yeast, because at some point, so one day later, that's when the winemaker started to smell H2S, so sulfur aroma, and so it was probably because we didn't have enough nutrients for the yeast to be healthy. And so that was what we did to avoid getting too much H2S. And then after a few days of fermentation, we did bottle when we still had some bricks. So for one bean, we bottled at 2.6 bricks, and for the other bean, it was at 1.5 bricks. And so that bricks of bottling was just based. So we try to bottle at a level of sugar where some fermentation would still ongo in the bottle, but we didn't want to have too much, because if you have too much sugar, you're going to have too much fermentation ongoing. And I'm going to explain that later. So the other aspect of the project was still on soaked pomace, but evaluating different yeast strains and also different grape cultivars. So in this case, we used Petite Pearl again, and we compared with Marquette. So Marquette, that's also a red grape that's cold hardy. So it has been developed by the University of Minnesota, probably, I would say, 30 years ago. And so that's the most popular red grapes that's grown in Iowa and in Minnesota. So we use those two different cultivars to compare the effect on the quality of the Piquette. So we soaked those two independently, those two pomaces. Those two pomaces, were frozen once we were done with the winemaking process. And when we had a little bit more time, we defrosted those pomace before adding some water. So we did add water to that pomace. We let it soak for 2 days. It also contains some acid and potassium metabisulfite. So it was at cold temperature. And after 2 days, we did add sugar for targeted bricks of 10.5. And then we did inoculate with 3 different yeast strains, all those different juice, if I can say, solutions, let's say solutions. And so we did add GoFerm as well and Ferment K because the YAN level was really, really low. And then we had fermentation for about less than a week before bottling at about 1.6 bricks. And so the selection of the yeast strains that we use was really based on the needs for the YAN, but also the sensory effect. So what could we expect from those different yeast? So we used ECV D254 we use cross evolution, and we use exotic mosaics. And that's really just to compare between the different aroma. So in ECB D254, we expected to have a lot of fruit aroma. The cross evolution was for more floral aroma, and then exotic mosaics was just overall to enhance the aromatic potential. So we use those 3 different yeasts on both the Marquette and the Petite Pearl Piquette. Then after all of those, we did evaluate the basic chemical parameters. We looked at the Brix, pH, TA, ethanol content. The Brix was followed, or fermentation was followed. So we looked at Brix and the temperature during fermentation between all those conditions. Then we looked at the color parameters of those piquettes, and we evaluated the organic acid, sugars, alcohol that we had. And also we did evaluate sensory. So we did sensory evaluation with 15 panelists. So they were not trained panelists. And that was really to have to know the preference of those piquettes. So we asked questions about rate your preference of color for each individual piquette, rate the appearance, rate the aroma, and rate the acceptability. And also we asked the question about how much would they pay. So if that's a product that would be available for purchase, how much are they willing to pay? And then we did run some statistics. So the first thing that we looked at was really evaluating how alcoholic fermentation, the profile of alcoholic fermentation across those different conditions, comparing between the different yeast and yeast strains and between the different cultivars. So on the left, that's Marquette. On the right, this is all the Petite Pearl. So on the left, you can see both. The temperature was pretty stable over time, so it was pretty high. It was close to 22 degrees Celsius, so it's more than 70 Fahrenheit, if I'm not mistaken. And so you can see that for the Marquette that was using the cross-evolution yeast, fermentation was a little bit longer than for the other yeast, but overall, we always had a good fermentation profile. And then, so we did compare, we did evaluate the chemical parameters of all those piquettes. All those chemistry or all those parameters were evaluated after 8 months of storage. So it wasn't, those data are not right at bottling. That's really when the sensory evaluation happened. And so when we compared between all the Marquette versus all the Petite Pearl versus all the Petite Pearl with the different pomace to water ratio. So what we observed was that whatever yeast strains we used, no effect on the pH or titratable acidity or ethanol concentration was observed. So within the same variety, no effect was observed on the 3 parameters. However, when we looked at the parameters for color, so L star corresponds to the lightness, so how the ratio or the amount of blue versus yellow color. So that's what you can see on the picture here. And so the more red the more A star you have, the more red your product is. And the more B star you have, the more yellow your product is. And so when we compare within the same variety, but between the different yeast strains that were used, it wasn't necessarily showing any specific significant or any statistical differences between the yeast strains. However, when we compare between the Marquette and the Petite Pearl, you can see that those values are really different. And basically, the Marquette is showing a higher lightness, so more light, and more yellow color compared to the Petite Pearl. Then it was different between the Petite Pearl with different pomace to water ratio compared to just the Petite Pearl. And that's because we didn't use the same exact grape. So that's why the differences in color were different. Same for the pH and titratable acidity, it was slightly different. So pH was higher for the Petite Pearl made with the different pomace to water ratio compared to Petite Pearl with the different yeast. And once again, that's because we didn't use the same grape cultivars, or the same cultivars, but not from the same place. Then we just looked at organic acid, sugars, and glycerol. And so I'm mainly focusing on, so fructose and glycerol were the two main compounds that were in higher concentration in Petite Pearl with the first yeast with ECV D254. And that's potentially because this yeast is a medium glycerol producing yeast. And so that's why it was showing up higher concentration of glycerol was observed in this Piquette. Also a little bit more fructose, but that's just good to see that we had a little bit more fructose in this Petite Pearl #1 Piquette, because that's how it can be related to the perception of consumers. And also we checked that the acetic acid content, because that's what I mentioned at the beginning. You can have a little bit of VA, so volatile acidity, when you make Piquette, depending on bacteria, how much bacteria you can manage and avoid getting. And so we just checked that the acetic acid content wasn't too high, and so it was low, which was good news. So then, as I said, we did run the sensory evaluation. So on 15 panelists, most of them were female. So 67% were female, 73% were white, and then the age was between 25 to 75 years old. We asked the question about how many times a month do you consume sparkling wine, and that's really just because Piquette is a sparkling beverage. And so we wanted to see if the panelists had consumed sparkling wine, if they knew what was a sparkling product. And so 40% of them mentioned that they consume sparkling wine fewer than once a month, and 40% once a month. And so then we did... So that's when we asked them to rate their pleasantness. So they had to rate how much the pleasantness of the color, the pleasantness of the appearance, the smell, the taste, and the mouthfeel. The appearance was more about the bubbles and if they had any sediment, because you can have a lot of sediments when you make Piquette. And so overall, the market that was made with exotics mosaic yeast was less rated for the appearance and for the color. However, when we compare between the different yeast strains that were used for Petite Pearl, no significant differences were observed from the consumer preference. And then looking at just Petite Pearl that was made with the pomace to water ratio, it seems that the smell of this Petite Pearl with the almost 1 to 2 pomace to water ratio was the least pleasant, especially the smell. And that's potentially because when we started to smell H2S, it was already too late. Even though we added some ferment K and DAP, the smell was staying there. And so it was shown by the ratings of the consumers. Then we try to evaluate the acceptability overall of those piquettes. And so we made correlation between the chemical parameters we evaluated and the acceptability rated by consumers. And so the main drivers of acceptability for those piquettes were the appearance and the color parameters. And so here you can see all those different colors swatched. That's really based on the L star, A star, B star parameters that I mentioned earlier. And so that's just to give you an idea of what is the color of those piquettes, or what was the color of those piquettes. So you can see that the color were really different depending on what we were talking about. So the marquette was pretty pink, gray, if I can describe that way, like salmon gray. And then the Petite Pearl were more pink. And it doesn't really relate to the real color, but it just gives you an idea compared to Petite Pearl with the 2 pomace to water ratio, where it was more gray brown. And so looking at the acceptability of those different piquettes, you can see that the marquette made with exotic mosaics was the least accepted. And similarly for the Petite Pearl with the 1:2 ratio of pomace to water. And that's most likely because of the color. And so then when we ask how much would you piquette, so a bottle of 750 milliliter of piquette, we had a wide range of answers, but overall you can see, so marquette number 3, so with exotic mosaics was the least acceptable. And so it was the piquette that consumers are willing to pay less than $10. So that's a real sign that it wasn't the most accepted product. But then compared to Petite Pearl that were made with those 2 specific yeast, that's where you have a wide range of willingness to pay. And for those 2, there are some consumers were willing to pay even more than $25 the bottle. So that's a good sign that was those piquettes were accepted and were like they are willing to pay, so they are willing to buy, and yeah, they really accepted and wanted to have that product. So just to give you an idea of how much that was costing us to make 1 bottle of piquette, so we didn't consider any energy. So the cost of energy, we didn't consider the cost of labor. We didn't consider the cost of having the punch down, the press, the room, but really just looking at how much that was costing us to use the specific materials. And so the materials are really the pomace, which is just the waste. So either you don't gain anything from putting that pomace in the landfill, or you just reuse it to make that piquette. Then you need water, you need sugar or honey, you need acid, you need the yeast, you need go-firm and nutrients, you need some potassium metabisulfite, and you need bottles and crown cap if you bottle in champagne bottles. But overall, it was just costing us $3.5 per bottle. But once again, that's just an estimation. It was only looking at the cost of the material, nothing else. So now just to finish on piquette and what we have been making. So there are a lot of challenges that you need to consider. It's not just you take the pomace, you add water, and then you add the yeast, and something is gonna come out of that. You have some challenges to manage storage, to manage transportation of that pomace, but also the quality of the pomace. So depending on how is the pomace obtained and what you do with that pomace, like where do you store this pomace and how long do you wait before using, you might have you have a lot of risk of microbial spoilage. not only in your pomace, but in your winery overall. So making sure if you decide to make Piquette, making sure you reduce the amount of time you're gonna store the pomace before you make the product. That will reduce the risk of spoilage because, as I explained at the beginning, pomace is rich in water. So you have moisture, you have pretty high pH, and you have bacteria and yeast that are either from the grapes, if that's a pomace from a white grapes, but that are also introduced during the winemaking process if you're using pomace from a red wine. So all those factors are creating high risk. And so once again, it's not going to be a risk just for the Piquette or just for the pomace, but you can have cross-contamination if you use different storage vessels for your winemaking and for the Piquette. So make sure all the time you clean and you sanitize everything you use. And you keep somehow those two different things separated. Also, when you add water, so you're changing the pH, you're changing the acidity, you're gonna decrease the acidity. And so, as you know, if you decrease the acidity, that means your pH increase. And so bacteria loves neutral pH. They love low acidity. And so you need to maintain that acidity level to a low acidity level. Bisulfite to maintain and to reduce the risk of spoilage. Also, oxygen exposure and temperature are extremely challenging, so you should manage those two appropriately. Also, depending on the pomace that you use, so if you use pomace from red grapes or red winemaking, that means you already have done fermentation, and so the amount of nutrients are going to be low. And that's really what we observed in one of our projects where we had too low YAN, or not enough YAN, not enough nutrient. And so that's when we started to smell the hydrogen sulfide. And so if you don't react immediately, or if you don't prevent that, that's when you're going to get a lot of H2S, and it's going to be challenging to remove that because Piquette is a natural product and you cannot really make too many additions. So you cannot use copper, you cannot use different products. And then, so another parameter to consider is the amount of bricks or the amount of sugar you have when you bottle everything, because fermentation is still gonna go will go in your bottle. Sorry, and so the more sugar you have at bottling, the more fermentation is gonna go. And so the more CO2 is going to be formed and you have a high risk of explosion. And so here, it's not easy to see, but in this picture, you can see that the bottle that's completely on the right, you see a little bit of Piquette outside of the bottle. And that's by opening a bottle without losing everything from the bottle because it was too high. The bricks at bottling was too high and the CO2 was way too much produced in those bottles. Also, when you make Piquette, following those techniques, you don't do filtration, you don't do any real racking, or you do racking, but that's the only step. And so in your bottle, you have a lot of sediments. So that's what we ask panelists consumers to evaluate when we ask for the appearance. We didn't ask the appearance just for the bubbles, the fizziness, but we also ask for the sediments. And because when you open the bottle, you're creating a change, and CO2 is just all the bubbles that are created are just pushing all the sediments. And so it's creating a mixture that can be not really nice looking, but it's a good product. And another consideration is about regulation. So there is no strict regulation in the sense that it's not a wine. So that's just a beverage that's made from a pomace or like from a waste. And so I believe that through TTB, it's mentioned that it's a product that contains less than 7% alcohol by volume. In that, and when this is the case, it has to go through FDA for labeling regulations. So yeah, regulation, that's another aspect. All right, so just to conclude on everything that I mentioned, so the piquette that we made from the market, pomace with the exotic mosaics was the least accepted by consumers. And that might be due to the color, but also to the particles, the sediments that were in suspension. Also, we had a better impact of the grape cultivars. So the Petite Pearl was preferred by consumers compared to the market. And the yeast strains that we used did not fully develop their potential. And so that's probably why we didn't really observe significant differences between those piquettes from the same cultivars, but using different yeast strains. And so another ongoing project right now that's we are starting to make piquette, but using the same technique that we used, which was soaking the pomace in water for about 2 days, and then pressing and starting fermentation on that solution, compared to pomace that's in which we add water, we inoculate with the yeast, and we add sugar. We do fermentation on the pomace, so similar as a red winemaking, and then pressing before bottling. So that's the ongoing project. And so hopefully we're going to have news very soon, because that's a quick process. On that note, I would like to thank you all for listening to me. I hope it wasn't too bad with the internet connection, but also all the people who worked on that project, especially the winemakers. So Kent Fulker and Christy Walker from Cedar Ridge Distillery and Winery, and Walker Homestead Farm and Winery.
Thank you, Aude.
Thank you.
So please, if you have questions, type them now in the chat box or the Q&A question. We do have a few. So the first one was about cap management with your piquette, but you pressed before you didn't ferment on the skins, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So we just took the pomace, we did add water, we let it soak. And so we did cap management in the sense that we did punch down once a day, just to make sure the pomace was mixed correctly. Okay.
So you did cap management just to make sure that the pomace was incorporated once a day?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. The other question was, why did you use citric acid rather than tartaric acid to acidify?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a question that other winemakers asked me already. And so there is no real answer to that question. That's really because it was the main acid that was available to the winemaker at that time. Yeah, I think that's the main things. But this year, so the project that's ongoing, we just add tartaric acid.
I see. So another question for somebody who joined late in the session. How much water did you use? What was the original sugar level in bricks? Yeah, how much water did you use and what was the original sugar level?
So for the pomace to water ratio, we use about 400 liters of water for about between 90 kilograms and 180 kilograms of pomace. And so we kept that ratio, or we kept the 1-to-2 ratio for the other experiments. The bricks that we had initially, when we just added the water to the pomace, was literally zero, like 0.2 2 or 0. And that's why we did have to add sugar just to have a targeted Brix.
Thank you. Do you think you're gonna continue experiments with fresh pomace in the future?
I would love to. However, there are a lot of different projects that I'm managing at once. And so working on a Piquette project at the same time that managing the other project, that's really challenging for me. But that's why we freeze everything before making Piquette. But that would be the best, is to use fresh pomace.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to see the differences there.
Yeah.
So do we have any more questions at this point?
And to continue on that frozen pomace versus fresh pomace, I think using frozen pomace is helping in the extraction of color, of pigments, of everything from the red pomace compared to the fresh. So that would be very interesting to compare between fresh versus frozen pomace, because I'm sure the color would be much lighter from the fresh pomace compared to frozen.
And how about enzymes? Would you consider using enzymes on the pomace?
We could, but one aspect of making Piquette is really similar as making a natural product, avoiding having too many additives.
That's right.
And so, yeah, I don't really want to add enzymes because I want to keep something pretty easy, clean, or like clean in the sense that I don't add too many different things.
Yeah, that's fair. Any other questions? Okay, one. How do you feel about disgorging Piquette?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. I think that would be good in so doing the same as when you make champagne to get rid of the particles and the sediments. I think that I'm not sure. Because on one hand, I think it would be good to remove, as I said, all those sediments. But on the other hand, as soon as you open, you're going to lose most of the remaining
Carbonation.
Carbonation. And so how do you get a little bit more?
Yeah, the pressure inside is probably lower than a regular sparkling wine, because you don't have. I would assume the pressure is lower. I suppose you could freeze the neck and all of that, but this would add labor and costs for a product that is. It depends on the perception of the product, but I mean, it's an interesting thought.
But then the pressure is really depending on how much Brix you use for bottling. And so, as I showed, for one of them, we bottled with a 2.6 Brix, and it was way too much because we had so much Piquette coming everywhere. That was way too much.
I think you froze during that that explanation. I don't remember hearing that, but that's cool. That's good to know. Another question, what about cold stabilization for tartaric acid? I haven't measured it yet this year, but I would guess it should be a good idea. So this is from somebody who's making Piquette in Norway, or somewhere. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would you do cold stabilization? Because I'm guessing if you do cold stabilization, co-stabilization process. So it might be good to remove some tartrates, but at the same time, you can increase the risk of like oxidation, and you're gonna probably have your yeast are not gonna survive the cold temperature for cold stabilization. And so you're gonna lose all that beneficial effect of CO2 being produced. That's my guess. So I wouldn't do cold stabilization for Piquette.
Thank you. Another question, what will be your suggested expiry date for Piquette?
Oh, that's a good question. That I don't know. Um,
I never thought
yeah,
about expiry dates for wines.
yeah.
Um,
I guess it's similar as so it's a fizzy, it has a lot of carbonation. Um, I guess you might have a change of color over time. You might get some oxidation. I don't know. I don't have any specific ideas about expiration dates.
what about doing secondary fermentation in bottle, like traditional method? In this way, you have a more controlled, you have more control over the pressure, but no disgorging to save labor.
Um, I don't know because so if you do malolactic fermentation, you're gonna have a change of the
I don't think they
texture.
mean malolactic. I think that just like the fermentation. I think they mean an fermentation in bottle. After you add the water and the sugar and the yeast, just ferment in bottle. But that would be you'd
But
have
that's
a lot of
what's
pressure with that. You
but
can't.
that's already ongoing. That's what's happening. So for the piquette, you have fermentation ongoing in the bottle. So you have
Or
the
partial
yeast,
fermentation. I think they mean the
yeah.
whole fermentation.
But then yeah, you may need to use different bottles. Like
Mhm.
yeah.
I don't I mean even with the traditional method, the
Mhm.
secondary fermentation has less sugar added, right? You don't add 12 bricks to that
Mhm.
base wine. You add a lot less
Yeah.
for the secondary fermentation. So here you can only do the late part of the fermentation in bottle, like with pet nat basically.
Mhm.
It's a similar
Yeah.
process. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. But once again, I think so in my mind, making piquette, that's really a natural way of using pomace and an easy way of using pomace to create a new beverage, but without creating more expenses,
Mhm.
more time. It shouldn't be time consuming or more time consuming. It shouldn't be more involving more expenses.
I guess with that being said, anybody can experiment
Yeah,
with whichever approach they think interesting and let us know.
yeah,
Maybe they come up with something that we haven't thought
hmm
of.
yeah.
Bob says we ferment fully in tank to dryness, then filter and force carbonate.
Okay,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, crystal clear, not a problem. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is it for this webinar. Thank you, Aude, for being available and giving very interesting presentation. Thank you all for attending. Please don't forget about the survey. Take 2 minutes of your time to fill out those responses. I would greatly appreciate it. And with
Mhm.
that, I wish you all a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.